Thank you, Mary, for putting this talk together. So briefly to introduce the other panelists, to my right here we have Maxwell Graham, who has an excellent booth over in the Nova section. Lauren Van Haaften-Schick, who's an academic and came down from Cornell to participate, and Tony Matelli, who also has a sculpture over in Art Basel Public right now. So to kick things off, before we dive in too deeply into legislation and contracts, I know that the panel wanted to discuss just a really fundamental question, which is, are resale rights for artists something that is really, is it a morally correct proposition? And Tony, I was hoping you could give us your views on that.
Excuse me. At the face of it, this idea sounds just in general incorrect to me. So I thought it was important just to go over the subject of whether or not this is even a good idea. Who is it really serving? Who is it hurting? What are the problems with it? And why, in fact, this should even be a thing.
Yeah, and to make sure that everybody is up to speed on what we're really talking about here, we're talking about the idea that an artist would receive a portion of the proceeds of a resale of an artwork after that initial sale. So after it's gone through the gallery, when the collector resells the work, some portion of the proceeds would go back to the artist, which is pretty unusual when you're talking about physical objects being resold.
So if it's unusual, what's the reason for this? What's the purpose of this? Other than just getting a little more money on the side, right?
And that very well will be it. Lauren, I know that you've spent a lot of time thinking about the ethics of this. Do you have a point of view?
Well, I guess first off, in terms of the legislative aspect of it, artists are the only visual artists are the only type of artists in the U.S. who don't receive any royalties from their work, save for the rare image licensing fee or something like this. It's really the only means of a continued profit from their work. Say, especially for artists who don't wish to keep participating in the market at a certain point, or even who change their practices radically and their work no longer becomes saleable in the same way. On the legislative end, resale royalties are a reciprocal right, which means that it's something that in order for an artist to receive a resale royalty from the sale of their work, either at auction or gallery, depending on the country, in another country, their home country must also offer a resale royalty. So this is more an argument in favor of legislation, but it's to say that there already are resale royalties in practice in many other countries or many other aspects of the art market globally, and so in the US, we're kind of maybe operating at a bit of a disadvantage. And I would say
Maxwell,
too,
hold on. Maxwell,
sure.
So addressing more of Tony's sort of a high-level question there of should this be something that artists are even asking for, right? And not necessarily how do we get there, but should we even be offering something like this? And you obviously work with a lot of artists, and how do you feel about that, just as a fundamental?
I think artists can do a very proficient job of speaking and acting on their own behalf, and I think they should set the terms of the discourse. I think it's very important that we lengthen the conversation, and when we're talking about resale rights, to not simply think about it in terms of finance, because resale rights extend much beyond that. And the fight for resale rights, as it kind of starts in the 60s, has had major progress. In 1988, I could show a damaged piece of yours, call it yours. I could show a piece of yours covered in glitter, call it yours. I could show a piece I had made and call it yours. I could show a piece of yours in an exhibition about something you despise, call it yours. And three of those things I can no longer do. The Visual Arts Rights Act of 1990, which is an effect of the resale rights movement, has given you a lot of control over what can be claimed as your work or not your work. And instead of merely thinking about it in terms of profit, I think it's important to just think about it in an even larger conversation about our society now and how much we're willing to indulge in quote-unquote free market practices that are never actually free market.
I think those aspects of the legislation make perfect sense to me. I'm in favor of artists having total control over the intellectual property of their work. So I think that the things that you just mentioned kind of exist in that sphere to me, the argument over intellectual rights. Where it gets sticky for me is when we're not talking about intellectual property and when we're talking about actual property. And to me, it seems that artists have many other ways of leveraging advantage from the resale of their work. And so, just to go back
Can you articulate specifically what you're thinking about there?
It generates more demand for their work. They're able to raise their prices. Maybe they kept some of that older work themselves. They could bring it to auction for an increased price, thereby receiving all of the profit. It seems to me that a smart artist is able to navigate that. And then what happens if the work devalues? You know, does the artist then have to, in this very, very narrow aspect of this law, does the artist then have to pay a percentage of its devaluation to the collector who, you know, at their own risk bought maybe risky things? If the work falls apart, what happens then? If the work becomes worthless, you know, what happens then? Worthless in a monetary sense, anyhow. So for me, disregarding all of the other aspects of intellectual rights that you just mentioned, in this very narrow aspect of this, it seems to at face fall apart, the argument.
Right. So the idea of allowing somebody to control downstream commerce when you're thinking about just the physical property is something that you're not entirely comfortable with.
It just doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't make any
sense.
sense.
Because it doesn't apply to any other physical object that gets sold. If I resell my couch, does IKEA get a percentage of that resale?
Right. Nor does your architect get a percentage of the house when you resell.
Exactly right.
Right. And I think you've actually raised a lot of the counter arguments to very specifically the legislation, and one of the reasons why the U.S. doesn't have legislation right now, one of the reasons why the California courts have recently ruled that the California state statute is no longer law. They invalidated it on a dormant commerce clause issue, as well as then very specifically said that the federal copyright preempts the state law.
Yeah, the first sale doctrine.
Right.
Yeah.
So understanding that right now we are in a time in which there is no actual law, there are no statutes in the U.S. that apply to it, people have been using contracts as a way to have resale rights for artists on an individualized basis. And there's the economic right, and then I think sometimes there are some other aspects and some other reasons why people use these in terms of literally controlling the sale. And Maxwell, I know that you've been using the contract in your gallery. Can you tell us a little bit about what appeals to you about using a contract?
I think the conversation, even if it's just about the profit, the financial profit, is often, should artists get a portion or should dealers get a portion of the resale or not? And I think it's a rather unambitious conversation to have. I think the conversation could be, should there be resales? What does it mean that we live in an art world and we encourage people to sell artworks again? I remember a very powerful dealer, one of the main dealers here, told me, for my business to work, I would have to sell every single artwork 3 times. Once primary, a second time 5 years later, and a third time 25 years later. And each time would be much more rewarding for me. And instead of even worrying about, you know, can I use a contract up front or can I use legislation up front to then get a cut of those resales, are there other measures I can do that encourage collectors and museums to not resell?
And what is that? What is the nature of that contract, though? If you're implementing that, what does it look like?
So I have some here. The contract, one of the couple of contracts I use is the Siegelob-Perjansky contract, which is from 1971. And you sign a copy, you would sign a copy, and you, the collector, would sign a copy. And if the work was resold, you would be notified. You would get 15% of the profit. You get a say in conservation. You get half of the proceeds from the owner if that work generates funds. For instance, when a museum tours your work, they make some money off of your work. And maybe there's one or two other things. And I'd say 1 in every 4 or 5 sales I use it.
And what's been the reaction from collectors?
Jackie Windsor, who's one of the first people, oftentimes this discussion is only about political artists, overtly political artists, and I think it's a, rights, as the ACLU will tell us, rights are for those on the left and on the right. And one of the first people to use the contract was Jackie Windsor. And I think her first 15 pieces of the first several years of her career, she used it. And Windsor's just a kind of a minimalist, no politics, no social agenda in her work. But she used it because her work was so slow and so gorgeous and so careful and so fragile that she was worried if it just entered the free market, it could be damaged or destroyed or thrown away. And she used it merely as a guarantee that someone believed and cared in this work beyond their finances. As we all know, with Amazon, et cetera, we delegate our money very loosely. But I just want to say that Windsor said, by the time someone was willing to sign the contract, she almost didn't need them to anymore. It had already been a filter.
Yep.
And I feel that same way, actually. And so if all the contract does is wave away certain people that might not want to use it, if it waves away certain people that might have other ideas that they have a right to, they might have other ideas about what an artwork is supposed to do, then it's done its job.
But don't dealers do that anyway? I'm sorry.
Not always.
Yeah, not always, and some are notorious for selling it to people who are interested in flipping it. Don't do business with those people as an artist if you're really concerned about protecting your work, for the next, say, decade or longer. There are decisions to make. I think there's something that feels unnecessary about this, honestly, because those people are identifiable. Oh, that guy's the flipper. Don't sell it to him.
Well, yes and no.
Yes and no, yeah.
I don't think so. I think Jackie Windsor is a very interesting case to bring into this because she actually stopped using the contract at a certain point. Once she did achieve a kind of, let's say notoriety perhaps, where she didn't have to kind of take these extra lengths or extra perhaps like defensive lengths, right, to really protect her work, her conceptual interest in it, and then also. I think the resale royalty did fit in this with her as a way of basically kind of asking for herself as an artist and her work to kind of be more taken more seriously than it were otherwise. So I don't know. I want to push back against this because I do think that the protective aspects we don't have to call them defensive, but on one level, protective aspects of something like, a contract that will stand for the artist as the articulation of, how they want their work as property to be treated or to live on, is hugely important. And, but also, the thing about contracts, just in general, which we're forgetting in this whole conversation, is that they're two-way. Right? I mean, a contract is only enforceable. A contract requires consideration to be enforceable, but that means that a negotiation has to occur, something has to be bargained for, something has to be exchanged. That's a two-way. And there's a way in which if we, what the kind of, I think like very poetic and tangible, like real project of something like the Siegelob-Perjansky agreement really is that it kind of asks for us to acknowledge a possibility and or maybe think it as a reality that the artist and collector and dealer are really kind of operating on an equal plane here, that we are actually all capable of coming to the table as
so
equal
right. So
parties.
something that I'm hearing from sort of all three of you really is that the contract opens a dialogue, and in some ways might be a useful way to even educate a new collector who doesn't necessarily know what the expectations are. Maybe they've been reading in the newspaper a lot of things about how art is a great investment, and so they just naturally come to a place like an art fair and are looking at things from the economic value and just through no fault of their own, but really a lack of exposure and a lack of conversation, haven't had that education yet. So why have galleries and artists, why have more of them not adopted a contract like this? What have been some of the traditional objections or hurdles? Because this is 45 years old and there was a sense that it would be widely adopted, and yet obviously we don't see that.
Yeah.
What have been some of the stumbling points, or Lauren or Tony even?
Well, this question of the artist as speculator is certainly one kind of aspect of this, and it's still.
The artist
maybe
isn't the speculator. The collector is the speculator in this case, right?
Well, but this is the question, though. I think this is one of the big challenges to the very idea of a resale royalty. And this comes from everybody involved. Artists say this, there are collectors who say this, there are dealers who say this, there are lawyers who say this. That it makes the artist a speculator in their own work, which is maybe one, still kind of
Right, because Lauren, you're
practice.
implying that when they see their work up at auction, they are excited for it to go higher because then they're getting 15% of that profit, and
Right.
they may be doing things to enable the increase in value.
Yeah,
in
or-
order to receive the royalty.
Yeah, or even in their thinking about making their
Yeah,
work
the
would
point
be
of
more
origin of
about,
the work,
what
yeah.
can I sell?
That makes sense, yeah.
Even more so than it might already be. Yeah. So that's a criticism of it. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. But, on one level, I think if we do accept that there is kind of, speculative practice going on, why is it so bad if the artists take part in that too? That's one thing. But
Maxwell, in your usage of the contract, how have the artists in your gallery reacted to it? Presumably not all of them were familiar with it until you brought it to them as a possibility. Do you see them having any sort of speculative sense? And has anybody actually resold any work that's signed the contract?
I think what motivates most of us in the art world, the professional art world, and has been a hindrance on more regulation is greed. The art world is a kind of a world of shadow finances, and the volume with which people do not pay sales or use tax. All of the galleries here, how few of the transactions that happen this week will go down officially on the record and will be generating revenue for Florida. These will all be invoiced on Monday. I'm not sure I answered the question. Just to throw back to one thing about
You made us all ponder sales tax in Florida for a moment, though.
who it's really profiting is not Florida. It's individuals and corporations. Just to go back about this thing about art being different or similar to other objects. As a dealer, I understand that I have some responsibility and some cushioning in helping or hurting an artist's career. I believe that. But I also really believe that a good artist is the one that's most responsible for their success. You're still a somewhat young artist, and in 30 years, if your work is worth much, 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 much more, I would say you had a very active role in that. And that's less the case with many other objects or pieces of property. So that's a bit different.
I'm not even sure about that. I mean, there's a there's a design fair over there, I would say that the way those pieces value over years and the way certain designers' careers value over years is exactly the same as the way an artist would. Even you know, a corporation making cars, let's say. Let's choose a random thing. The cars are good, they get better, and the prices go up, and they sell more. The cars are shitty, they get worse, and they don't sell so many. So,
I came here a little bit early, and I looked underneath the chairs in the audience, and the chair I'm sitting on, and this table. And you better believe these are, you know, proper Herman Miller.
yeah.
And the heirs to the Herman Miller family and the heirs to the Eames family gets a cut of these. So you're right that...
Right, but they don't get a cut of them after these get sold to whatever junk store goes, you know?
But there's this other revenue generating stream that is the result of their legacy where there isn't exactly with artworks. Mm-hmm. So it's a non-equivalent scenario.
So would you be in favor then of statutory resale rights? And if so, how would you define artist? Because there is then this problem of who does it apply to? Does it apply to some of the people over in the design fair? Does it apply to video artists? Does it apply to conceptual and performance art? You know, how do we start to parse that? Tony, you look like you have a thought.
It seems like the idea of resale or royalties, let's say, apply typically to reproducible objects, right? And so a unique work then would be excluded from that model, seems to me, anyway. That seems like the long and short of it.
Well, thinking about reproductions, one of the ways that most people encounter artwork, or the vast majority of it these days, is through something like Instagram, right? And so we are actually seeing images of works that are being reproduced over and over. And I know, Lauren, you started off by saying that copyright isn't valuable to artists, or that's the perception, right?
Yeah.
Is there possibly a way where we can think differently about copyright and think differently about the dissemination of images in the art world to benefit artists a little bit more in that way?
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of an open field right now, actually. And to clarify, actually, one point that you said about who do we actually count as artists? It's right now, what defines a work of art under copyright is very, very limited. It's, you know, paintings, sculptures, drawings, editions, 200 or less. You know, things like video, digital art are really kind of up for grabs, and it's clearly totally outdated statute the way it's written now. I mean, and as far as, you know, figuring out some kind of mechanism for tracking, say, like Instagram reposts or something like this, this is where I say it's an interesting open field, right? Because I mean, there are people very actively kind of experimenting with, you know, the future of blockchain, or say like encryption, or you know, tracking, I don't know, metadata for images. Somebody more knowledgeable about that could chime in, but it's really things are happening, going to be shifting very, very quickly right now where all of this is concerned, and hopefully in a way that actually addresses the fact that the way that copyright defines an artist now and effectively works or does not work for artists now is really, I don't know, not enough. I mean, it's telling that, you know, in the open hearings and, you know, roundtable discussions that the Copyright Office held regarding resale royalties, say back in the 80s and the early 90s even, artists were participating, artists were there. There were active dealers who were giving statements that are on public record now. In 2013, when the Copyright Office was preparing to revisit the resale royalty more earnestly, there's only one artist who attended the official roundtable, and he was only there for about an hour in the afternoon. There was one dealer, and it was from a gallery in upstate New York. You know, so it's like,
well, so what's interesting though is that the Copyright Office came out more in favor of artist resale royalty rights in 2013 when artists and dealers, you know, according to this accounting, weren't as active.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting question as well. And in terms of, is there a different way to monetize copyright? Do artists need more money? And Maxwell, I don't know if you have a thought on that, right? Because we're sort of presuming that something about this is a way to get artists more money, either by making copyright valuable or passing a royalty. But again, a little bit back to where we started, is that something that we should be working for? Is that an issue? Is that the issue? Maxwell.
Yeah, you go first.
I was talking to a dealer this morning. We were talking about the mythic San Francisco collectors, because there's a lot of wealth in San Francisco, new wealth and older wealth, and a presumption from people in the art world that these people should collect art. You know, if you're wealthy, you should collect art. And how absurd this is. You know, the people that have expendable income should not be spending it on art. They should be spending it on hospitals. They should be giving it to true nonprofit organizations. And two-way philanthropy is a very dangerous curse of the upper classes. And I think it extends to me as an art dealer and most artists who are in this fair, at least. I think we more than get our share. I think artists who are in this fair more than get their share. And the art world's just as exploitive as other kind of luxury industries. I could do with less money.
I think artists should get more money. But something like this seems to benefit the artists with the most money anyhow, and the most privilege. So someone like Jeff Koons or, anyone else at that level probably doesn't need something like this, right? If we're just isolating the monetary aspect of this, which is unfair, I know. Or Grotjan, does he need that? Maybe not.
Right, certainly one of the criticisms is that the Picasso
Yeah.
estate gets the lion's share
Yeah.
of royalties in Europe.
So, droit de suite, something that's not included on the sheet that's going around is Europe, the EU,
Well,
France.
It is
Oh,
actually.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. Sorry, excuse me. The EU has droit de suite. If you buy an artwork at auction, the artist gets a cut of it.
Yeah.
And it's capped. I think it's $3,000 on some artworks, $10,000 on other artworks.
Yeah,
12,500 euros is the maximum.
Right.
And so it's not massive. It doesn't, it doesn't matter how much your work sells for. The artist only gets so much. So that exponential Koons dividend isn't actually happening. And it works. There are older artists that sell 5 to 10, $20,000 things at auctions in Europe. And they get some money off of it.
Yeah.
And the worry that the auction market would evaporate in those countries is just not true.
I guess the question is, we can ask how beneficial it is, but I think we should also ask, well, would it really hurt anyone, too? How come we're not starting there? One of the arguments that comes up, again, against the resale royalty is that, there's kind of skepticism about whether it would really be an economic incentive for artists to sell work or to produce work, which is supposed to be the function of, copyright in the U.S. But, one response to that is then, is it a disincentive?
Well,
go
I
ahead.
like getting the $50 in the mail
Sure.
from whoever reprints a photograph in Europe, or whatever the number is. That's cool. I would like to get money from a resale of something too. I'm arguing sort of against my own self-interest in a way, just because it doesn't make logical sense to me. And I would rather like feel like things make sense morally and ethically than to feel like this is a charitable benefit for artists. I think artists. It does a disservice to the power of artists to treat them like charity cases. And it does a disservice to artists when artists act like charity cases.
Yeah.
So something
Right.
like this
And
rubs me a little bit the wrong way.
Is it treating them like charity cases, though, or is it treating them like economic actors?
Well, I don't know, because if it doesn't hold up to the logic of any other resale, then I think that we need to consider this as charity.
And one thing that I want to jump in here with is one of the features of the statutes actually makes these rights non-assignable and non-waivable, which is very different than copyright. So it does
Yeah.
in some ways infantilize the artist and say that we don't believe that you'll be able to actually
I
make
think
these
that that's
economic
true, yeah.
choices on your own.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. You know, that's as the law stands in the EU, which is, I mean, kind of fundamentally different than the U.S. context in a lot of ways.
Well, the
but-
draft of the federal Artist Resale Royalties 2 Act also is non-waivable, non-assignable, California, similar-ish.
Right,
So
right.
there's a
is why-
pervasive sense that artists won't be able to manage this on their own.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's something that you guys think is a necessary feature of this.
Yeah, it's tricky. You know, I mean, with Vera rights, like those are waivable, and you know, when artists do commissions for museums or like public art projects, they are asked to waive their Vera rights, that's the Visual Artist Rights Act that Maxwell was describing earlier.
Although certainly not every time. In
No,
my work with
not every
artists,
time.
oftentimes we actually highlight the fact that VERA exists and state very clearly that those rights do apply for the artists.
Right.
But Maxwell, you wanted to jump in with
Yeah, I think some of these things you're saying, Tony, are very important about, you know, how we understand artists' rights and artists' resale rights, and you know, is it a charity to the artist? Is it a regulation? Is it a kind of tariff? And certainly, you know, there are other kinds of regulations on other industries. You know, you pump out this amount of smoke, you owe someone money, and it's supposed to keep those companies from pumping out that amount of smoke. And I think that some resale rights, whether contractual or legislative, would simply lead to less resales, which I actually think would really help your market. If the only way to get a piece from you was to go to your dealer and buy a new one, there would be much more demand for your new ones. And in fact, this resale market is watering down your primary market. And if there's a kind of tariff that keeps me from wanting to you know, buy a piece of yours from so-and-so client, and if I'm incentivized to buy it directly from you, it's more of a regulation than a kind of charity. Now, we all know that, you know, these things are complicated, and parking meters have as much to do with generating revenue as they do with keeping someone from parking someplace. And parking, you know, speeding tickets, we know what those are actually about. But does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it's a great argument, actually. I mean, it's very common that, you know, resale royalties are thought to just hinder primary market sales or just hinder art sales on the face of it. But this is a dimension I think is rarely brought up.
Although, for some people, there is a sense of security by being able to go to a place like ArtNet, see that there is a market, think that the price is in line with that secondary market. I know, Tony, some of your work has come to auction. Do you have a sense of how that plays in with your primary market? Do you agree with Maxwell?
I don't really agree with your point because I've just seen so many auctions happen. Yeah, my work has come up to auction, not much. And it seems mostly used to validate the primary sales, like what you were just saying. And the more and more paintings I see of my colleagues, paintings and sculptures, go up for auction, sell, go up for auction, sell, doesn't have anything to do with their primary market. They're doing just fine. The problem is when they fail at auction. So I want to know what is the reciprocal argument here. So the thing goes to auction, it fails, then what? You know, what good does this do at that point? It maybe keeps someone from taking it to auction.
It keeps someone from destroying it. It keeps someone from throwing the work away, which were not rights you had 20 years ago. But because of this movement, if your work becomes worthless, which the majority of art, you know, made by people under 50, that's being shown here, will eventually be worthless, if not in our lifetime, in our kids' lifetime. These rights keep me from being able to destroy that. And it also means that you get to keep track of where your work is. I think you're not so prolific as I understand it, which I mean as a compliment. But some artists who are, very, very, very productive, they have no idea where their works are in the world. And there's no measures to, keep control of that. And resale rights, in addition to giving you profit, they keep a tether between the object and you. So you can kind of, if not just control it, also just be aware of it. It's 1:34 on Sunday. Do you know where your artworks are?
I have a very good database.
Did they tell you every time they were sold? And why would they have any interest in updating you?
Of course not. Maybe, maybe not.
Right, so the works that have come up to auction are now in the hands of, we don't know, or you don't know.
Well, you know, but you don't know after that.
Right.
I mean, anything could be happening to them.
Right. And so, Maxwell, has anybody resold that you're aware of? Which is a different question.
I think that anyone who would be willing to use the contract wouldn't want to resell. And I have some collectors who insist on using it every sale. They like it. And they certainly get more access, as we call it in the industry, by using this. But there are many historic examples of people that have used the contract. There's some famous case studies with the legendary Hans Haacke, of his work being resold and the contract functioning. Daniel Buren. Every Daniel Buren that's in this fair has a kind of contract. Every Adrian Piper in this fair uses a contract. These are artists who had a Guggenheim retrospective and one's about to have a MoMA retrospective. It does function. And I'm always very cautious. We should always be cautious. When legislation is proposed and the opponents say, it's a good idea in theory, but it won't work, I never buy that caution. It's often a very conservative argument in social rights issues as well, of course.
And those opponents to legislation, when they say it won't work, what is usually the crux of their argument for why it won't work?
It's my understanding, kind of reading historic interviews with artists and dealers, the extraordinary Maria Eichhorn is a great artist who's written extensively on the contract. And she said mostly it was art dealers in the 70s and 80s who said to their artists, look, if you want rights, then I'll never sell your work again. No one will ever sign this. And I think artists really got bullied out of the opportunity to use this thing. And one of the things that I think is you were talking about new forms of distribution and interaction, my phone, et cetera, are that artists have longer reaches and certainly more power now, and also the art market, for the time being, knock on wood, seems to be much stronger and much broader internationally than it was, say, 30 years ago. And in up markets, in resilient markets, are the time to flex these kinds of rights. So when even the most famous artists of their day in the 70s were actually starving, I can understand how things had a higher degree of precarity, but there are plenty of artists now who it's just, they're drowning, and dealers are drowning in surplus. And we could certainly afford to give up some of that surplus to have safety nets to protect rights.
Well, you bring up an interesting concept here is the artist and dealer relationship. And would you be in favor of the dealer also participating in the resale right? I mean, it's a conversation that seems to be having a lot is how hard it is for some galleries to maintain their business because artists are up and out into bigger and better galleries. So should dealers be participating in the royalties and Lauren and Tony as well.
That's it might be a two-part question. For one thing, every time I use this contract, I do not profit. And history would tell me that they won't even be my artists in 10, 15, 20 years when the profits from this would be made. And my work on the front side might not, equal money for me later. And I think that's totally okay.
Okay. Even
this is
Sigalo
artist rights.
says that it would be within the realm of ethical behavior for the dealer to sort of write themselves into the contract, since they're doing the work not just with the contract but with the initial sale as well.
Right. Yeah. In a way that's recognizing, I think. Again, the fact that this is something that always has to be a two-way. It always has this. If we want to work towards any kind of solution for this or way of dealing with this issue, be it contract or legislation or whatever, artists and dealers and collectors all need to kind of come to this as collaborators, right, in whatever kind of future scenario or future vision they want to see. And that's the key thing, I think, about the fact that within the Sigalo-Brzezinski agreement, there is this mention that the artist might want to give even as much of a third of their resale royalty to their dealer as a way of acknowledging the work that the dealer puts in to help the artist, which is really important. I think it's one of the myths around all of this is that this conversation only comes up in a combative way or only comes up, again, in a defensive way, and I even said that earlier, but it's really a quite unproductive way to think about it, and actually...
Right, the ecosystem, we need everyone, right? We
Absolutely.
need the collectors, the dealers, certainly the artists. Tony, I don't know how you sort of feel about this vis-a-vis thinking about getting that $50 and maybe splitting some of it with your dealer, maybe not.
If something like this was ever to be enacted, I'd be fine splitting it with my dealer who made the original sale. Yeah, to me, I'm agnostic on it. Doesn't...
Right.
Yeah, it can be something that strengthens these relationships in the end, too.
I just want to point out, it's not just collectors, it's also museums that this would apply to.
Yeah.
And in our day and age, I don't think the gap is as massive between private collectors and public institutions for tax purposes, for esteem purposes. I don't think it's as broad as it once was. I just want to voice one other concern that I heard Hans Hake use not against, but a caution he had about legislation and making it a more legislative act was just it would mean more regulation in the art world, which has great benefits, but also there are flaws to regulation.
Certainly, there are costs associated with it, and again, looking at the European model, there's actually a cap, whereas under the contract, it's flexible, it's a negotiation, and it doesn't set up this more combative posture. I've been given the sign. Final thoughts. Do you think that we should be still focused on trying to get a law enacted in the U.S.? Is there a better place for us to spend our energies? What do you guys think?
There should be less resales of artworks.
That's it.
Right, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A, but anything else?
I mean, legislation is a defense, but at this point, I don't know. I just don't see how that's the most productive way to go forward in some ways. I think there's a lot of ways that we can recognize the kind of close ties that already exist in the art world and recognize the negotiations that already happened, recognize the fact that we are all kind of invested in this, in conceptually, morally, financially, all of it, and to kind of leverage the network that already exists to maybe come up with something better.
No thoughts. Already lots of good thoughts. Questions from the audience? Anyone? Yes. Right here in front.
I'm just curious how 15% came to be the percentage.
Oh, well.
It's not.
No. So the 15%, is what's noted in this document that we're referring to, the Stiegelob-Przyansky Agreement, which was written in 1971 by curator and dealer Seth Stiegelob and a lawyer, Robert Przyansky. And in the agreement, the 50% royalty is just, the artist gets that above the accrued value, right? 15% of that. But that just comes from another artist contract before. There actually wasn't a fixed number for that. Ed Kienholz had been using his own contract.
Right, so it's a suggested percentage in this contract, and then the statutes have different percentages and different ways of calculating it. So for instance, what we're referring to here is a percentage of profit, whereas legislation almost always is a percentage of the gross sales price. So to Tony's point, you can buy something, sell it for less, and still owe money to the artist. So for instance, the proposed act in the US right now is 5% up to $35,000. So again, lots of different formulas out there.
Yeah, that all look to each other, but it's all just kind of playing with existing formulas and building upon them.
It's called the Artist Reserved Right Transfer and Sale Agreement.
Yeah.
And transfer would be, interactions where no money is exchanged.
That's right.
And the contract and this movement starts or has its square, its square one at the Museum of Modern Art. An artist named Sarkis had an artwork that was totally damaged, a kinetic artwork that was totally damaged, and he said, look, my piece is busted. And MoMA said, it ain't your piece anymore. And a number of activist artist organizations started, getting together to think about how to amend this situation. And for me, all of this is not so much about numbers, but just that we remember. I can't tell you how many times I've been in someone's home and they say, what do you think of my piece? Don't you love my sculpture? Or they point to their iPhone more likely and say, in storage, look at my pieces. And I think it's very important we shift how we think about these things and realize it's always going to be yours, Tony.
And I think that's super valuable. I've even used that in a legal case before myself. So that precedent has helped me get a piece fixed and a piece removed from the public. So I have no reservation about that. I'm completely in favor of all of that. But again, I think that lies more in intellectual property rights. And to me, it just gets very complicated and problematic when we start talking about percentages for resale of objects that are already in the world, that I've already been paid for, that I could have raised the price in the initial sale for, that I could have saved one for myself for, many other ways to leverage that successful sale, other than this, which really just does not stand the water test for me. It just doesn't hold any water.
Any other questions in the back? Yes. Wait for the mic, please. There we go. Yep.
I was hoping with a very international global market, I was hoping you could talk more about the U.S.'s position related to the other precedent within France, droit de suite, and the UK. I mean, these are two major countries that contribute to contemporary art, as well as major countries who contributed art historically with their artists. They have this legislation. Why doesn't the U.S.? It seems like from your conversation, it's a negative, hugely negative in the U.S. to have this.
So, as I would guess that you're aware, there is proposed legislation in the U.S., and it has come up historically time and time again. Lauren mentioned the study in the 80s that the Copyright Office did, and at that moment they actually recommended that we not adopt a resale right. But one of the interesting things that they concluded with was, let's wait and see what the UK does, because at that time there wasn't droit de suite in the UK either. Through the European Union is how the UK actually was asked to harmonize their laws. And so they first adopted droit de suite in 2006. Post-Brexit, they probably won't have it anymore. So we're actually going to go back to a place where Europe has it, Australia, several other countries, but most likely not UK, China, or the US,
Right.
Which frankly makes legislation in the US less likely. Yes.
Hi, how are you? Oh, wow. Great conversation. Listen, I'm a counselor for college students, and I get a lot of them more and more who are interested in getting into the arts. If you had like a word of advice for them, what would it be? Or many words of advice?
Tony, you're shaking your head.
Oh my goodness. Do something you love and do it. You need 100% of your energy involved in what you're doing is the only advice I would tell anyone interested in any of the arts, is that it needs to be a singular focus, and it takes a very long period of time to get good at something.
I have to say, respectfully, I have the opposite advice. Don't plan on doing it for a living.
Yeah.
It's very hard to make good art, or art that works, the art that is true to you as an artist professionally. It's much more likely that you have another job and you do this for other purposes, whether they're personal expression, emotional, political, aesthetic. It's much easier to have kind of an integrity to it if you're not relying on it to feed your family. Because very, very, very few artists are able to rely on continual income from the arts over the course of their life. Remarkably rare.
I think that's good advice.
Yeah,
But also give it your all.
Because I think
Yeah.
the professionalism of the art world is a problem, and
Yeah.
I think ultimately probably generates bad art, more so than not. Maybe make sure their parents are super rich so they could be like dilettantes for their entire life, which in many cases will make much more interesting things.
Well, but also, I think, it's funny that, of course, this like professional practices is like a standard course now, or becoming in so many MFAs and all of this, and which is good and bad. But I think the good part of maybe just awareness of the kind of economic realities of all of this, which maybe includes some degree of knowledge of the legal realities, is actually a good thing. So I guess I would just say, do what you love. Don't try to do art for a living, maybe off the bat, but also kind of be self-educated about what you're getting into.
Right. Well, and I think that what you see from the panelists up here is there's lots of ways to be in the arts as well. So it may not necessarily
Yeah.
be just being an artist, but I, for instance, went to law school. So you can be in the arts and wear different hats as well. Any other questions? Yes. And microphone's coming.
So I was just curious, when you said it's a transfer agreement, what happens if, you're worried about, I guess the word would be price fixing, or, through the resale, indirectly linking it to other contracts, and then, if work is sold for X amount instead of, Y, the impact on the art market in general, like sales that totally wouldn't be covered by these contracts in kind of I guess the word would be sneaky backwater way. So what would you suggest? Are you worried about that being something that never could be regulated?
So if I hear you correctly, you're asking about fraud, right? And right. Well, so doing things sneaky or trying to do something in violation of a contract that you've signed. And I think that a lot of what you'll end up hearing is that you enter into these things in a trusting relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And if people want to break the law, break a contract, they're going to. They may get caught, they may not get caught. The art world is a very small place, and you end up finding out about a work being sold, and we have examples of people doing shady stuff all the time that ultimately gets out, right? But I think what we're dealing with here is appealing to people's best selves and hoping that if they agree to abide by this, they actually will.
Also, incidentally, I think a lot of galleries of the artists whose work is for resale are going to end up paying that 15 or whatever %.
Oh, you mean like the gallery would just the artist would just send
Yeah,
it
because
back
the
on?
gallery is supporting the artist's career, the gallery is pushing the price up, and there you go. That's where the money's coming from.
Maxwell, final thoughts. Nope. All right. We have been told that we are out of time. Thank you guys for being a great audience. Thank you for the panelists, and thank you to our Basel Miami Beach for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you, our Basel.
Thank you.